This is CBSNews.com's Political Year in Review broadcast. I'm joined today by our politics reporters Rob Hendin and Brian Montopoli, and a regular Washington Unplugged contributor, Charles Ellison. We're also going to introduce you today to a new country music sensation who really set Washington on its ear, literally, during a holiday appearance. Well, President Obama landed this morning in Hawaii for his Christmas vacation. He left hailing a number of legislative successes in the lame duck session of Congress, a Congress that some are saying achieved more than any other Congress in decades. So, is President Obama the comeback kid, as the conservative columnist Charles Krauthammer has said, or are we reading too much into this? Well, let's ask some people who know something about this because they follow these things. What about this? Rob Hendin? I mean, it was quite a lame duck session.
It really was, Bob. I think if we had done our poll about 2 months ago, it would have a very different outcome possibly. But he got a lot done, and no one really expected him to do it. So he really, comeback kid may be right.
What do you think, Charles? Are we giving him too much credit here, or who gets the credit for all of this?
Well, we might be. I mean, right now, for the past 2 weeks, he could be sort of labeled as the comeback kid, and he's gained a lot of political leverage and capital out of this. But now, let's see what happens in the 112th Congress. I mean, now, particularly with this tax cut deal, we've got to figure out how do we pay for it. That's $800 billion worth of basically red ink, and that's $800 billion that you had to borrow from the Chinese. And so obviously there's going to be some problems with that as we go into the next 60 days. I mean, right now the government's running on a continuing resolution, but now we're going to have to chisel out the budget and try to figure that out. How do we pay for this tax cut deal?
Brian Montopoli, let me ask you, this next Congress, the Democrats are going to be more liberal, the Republicans are going to be more conservative. Do you think this little winning streak that the president put together over this past couple of weeks, is it going to continue?
Excuse me, realistically, the Republicans are actually more divided now in a lot of ways than they were before. You look at someone like Lisa Murkowski, someone who was a pretty solid Republican, and now she's a maverick. She's voting with the Democrats on the DREAM Act and a lot of other issues. And there are a lot of Republicans. You've got people like Scott Brown, the senators from Maine, people who have shown openness to working with the Democrats. And, the other part of this is there's a strong argument that divided government is actually a lot more effective many times than single-party government, only because there's pressure on both sides to work together. The Republicans were able to say, at the beginning, look, we're just going to oppose everything. And that becomes a lot harder for them. And so I do think there's actually a good prospect going forward, despite the very hyper-partisan atmosphere in Washington.
One thing you didn't mention, while there is some division among Republicans, we really saw some divisions among Democrats this time around. I mean, Nancy Pelosi and her group were not, they were mad at the president, for one thing. Now, they were the ones who were not at all happy about the tax cut deal. So there will also be that part of it to deal with in the coming year, it seems to me.
Absolutely, and but ultimately the liberals did fall into line on this tax cut compromise. I mean, the tax cut compromise was a bitter pill for them. They had to swallow a tax break for the richest Americans, the estate tax levels, which they hated, but they agreed. I mean, Obama was able to sort of rise above, and you asked if he was the comeback kid. In Washington, I think everyone pays attention to these things a lot more closely than the American people, but Obama had a moment where he was able to say, look, I was able to bring both sides together. This is what he promised from the beginning, right, that he would rise above this partisanship. He was able to deal with the left, he was able to deal with the right, and he was able to work something out, and that really does bode well for him.
I must say, I thought that the most important thing the president said at his news conference yesterday, there wasn't a lot of, quote, news in his news conference, but it was the kind of change in attitude and atmosphere and all that. But I think the first words out of his mouth were, what I took away from the election was the American people said we should try to find common ground. And that's what I tried to do, and I hope the Republicans will take that to heart, too. That was a fairly interesting statement, I thought.
It was. I mean, that's all part of this sort of triangulation strategy that a lot of observers are accusing the White House of sort of conducting going into the next year, into 2011. Basically, he's sort of painting himself not as a Democrat, obviously not as a Republican. He wants to be the independent president. He wants to be the guy in the corner with the common folk. basically saying, hey, I'm chiseling out this strategy, I'm molding it for you, for the people. And so he's trying to make himself seem very different from players on either side of the partisan fence.
Well, I'll say one thing. He surprised one person, and that person was me. There was a time a month ago when I thought that there was a really good chance they would get absolutely nothing done except maybe a continuing resolution to keep the government from shutting down during this lame duck session. But it was anything but lame.
Lame
as
duck.
it turned out to be.